Hello and welcome. Today's webinar is Assessing Economic Impact of Disaster-Induced Transportation Disruptions using a University Community Partnership Framework. My name is Lacey Friedley. I am the Communications Coordinator at Portland State University's Transportation Research and Education Center. TREC leads the National Institute for Transportation and Communities, a university transportation center funded by the U.S. Department of Transportation. NITC consortium members are the University of Utah, University of Oregon, University of Arizona, University of Texas at Arlington, and the Oregon Institute of Technology. NITC's research priority is improving mobility of people and goods to build strong communities. Our presenter today is Dr. Divya Chandrasekhar from the University of Utah. She is an associate professor in the planning at the University of Utah. Her expertise is in community recovery from disasters. Her research has examined post-disaster community participation and capacity building, networking and coordination among recovery institutions, and disaster recovery policy in South and Southeast Asia, the Caribbean, and the US. This presentation will be about 40 minutes long. Then we will have 15 minutes to answer your questions. During the presentation, please submit your questions via the Zoom Q&A. After the webinar, you will receive an email with a link to the video recording and presentation slides. If you are tracking professional development hours, this webinar is eligible for 1 hour of continuing education credit. A certificate will be available on the event webpage after the event. And with that, I'll turn it over to our presenter.
Thank you, Lacey. I'm just going to take a minute and pull up my slides. Okay. If you can see my slides, please let me know.
Yes.
Well, thank you to both Lacey and Beth for that wonderful introduction. I don't need to give my name again, but I'm here today to talk about this project that we're just wrapping up, which looks at the economic impact of a potential earthquake in the Wasatch Front. The project was a truly collaborative one. We did this work with the University of Utah that included my own department in city metropolitan planning, but also the Utah Policy Institute. It's the Kempsey Gardner Policy Institute is the full name. They are part of University of Utah, but they're also what we call an AUBA, which is an association of university business and economic research entities. And there are AUBAs all over the country. Ours is the Policy Institute. From the community side, we had the Utah Division of Emergency Management, a really key partner in this, provided us with a lot of data. WFRC, which is the Wasatch Front Regional Council, it's our metropolitan planning organization, and they helped us with some travel demand modeling. And the Utah Inland Port Authority, which helped us to advise on the project scope and provide us some of the data for validation. A little hat tip to NITC for funding this project. We're very happy to do this. Now, the project really started with the genesis of this project was a conversation that I had with some FEMA colleagues in Region 8 who were, this is a few years ago, who were really wondering about how we could do more logistics related research that would help them in their planning. And the big question was, how does supply chains get affected if we had this big earthquake? And the earthquake we're talking about is the big one for Utah. We're expecting a 7.0 magnitude earthquake, well, sometime now. We get one every 300 years, and we are 300 plus years at the moment. The probability of getting a 6.75 or larger is exactly 43%, which is nothing to sneeze at. A 7.0 magnitude earthquake is going to be more impactful. And it is also one of the most common scenarios that is modeled or done for earthquake planning in the Wasatch Front, which is in Utah. So we were having this conversation with FEMA Region 8, and they were saying, oh, wish we were doing more supply chain. Are you able to do supply chain kind of work? In their heads, they were thinking about local administrations and how cities were prepared. But we were also thinking about economic impacts, so how businesses prepared, the ones who really use the supply chain a lot for everyday use. How would businesses fare in such a situation? And when we started looking into the topic, we realized it was really inaccessible, this kind of research. When we were looking at supply chain studies, they tended to either not be for public use, they were intended for companies, private companies to use for their own internal planning, or they were really complex models, things that just an average public administrator just wouldn't understand. It required an expert to be hired for this project. So for do a supply chain kind of work, and both of which are out of reach for communities that are pretty low resourced. So from the very start, we thought, well, why don't we think up a framework that communities can use, even low resourced communities can use by just collaborating with each other. You need a transportation model, there's a transportation model in your community. You need an economist, well, you have those. So what we wanted to do was develop, apart from assessing the actual impact of a potential earthquake in the Wasatch Front, we also wanted to create a framework that could be replicated in other communities, which were also low resourced or did not have enough money to hire someone fancy or to be able to understand this or do this themselves. So this is the genesis. We wanted to do this as a part of our objectives of the study. The study itself has two phases. The first is to assess the economic impact of transportation disruptions in a 7.0 earthquake. We want to look at transportation disruptions because they are one of the key things we've noticed in the COVID era as happening. But also it's something that we expect a lot to happen in the Wasatch Front if we have the 7.0 magnitude earthquake. We wanted to use low-cost replicable methods and then a university-community partnership. That was a phase one. So a sort of regional impact picture, a snapshot of what would happen at the regional level. But at the same time, we also wanted to know what the businesses are actually doing, because after all, there have been a few disasters in Utah recently. And so we wanted to know, if we know which are going to be the worst affected industries in an earthquake, we wanted to know how those industries actually have dealt with existing disasters. What have they been doing? What kind of impact have they had on the supply? In some ways, it validates what we are estimating, right? So from both perspectives, from a regional impact perspective, doing all this empirical work, and then from a survey method to figure out what the businesses are actually doing. These are the two phases of the disaster, of the project. In terms of the scope, I mentioned that we're looking at transportation disruption. So we focused only on transportation dependent industries. Every industry in the NACIS list classification is somewhat transportation dependent, some are more and some are less. We're looking at the 7.0 earthquake scenario in the Wasatch Front, which is actually a 6-county region. Like I mentioned, it's a metropolitan planning organization. And we wanted to use commonly available tools, things that you'll find anywhere in the country. So for example, HASSMH is the leading impact assessment software. It's free, it's offered by FEMA, it's developed by FEMA, it's offered through FEMA. And what it is, it's just an impact assessment. You can actually decide, you can, for instance, decide that you want to study an earthquake in Salt Lake City segment of the Wasatch Fault. And it can, and once you run the scenario, it can tell you the impact on critical infrastructure, lifeline infrastructures like roads and water and power. But it can also tell you, for instance, how many people will be displaced, what are the casualties, it can tell you how many buildings will be affected, what will be the building loss. Can tell you some types of economic loss, for instance, how many businesses, if it costs to relocate, how much it would cost businesses. So HASS is a very commonly available software, and almost all the states in the country use it in some way or the other. The other very common type of model is the travel demand model. Almost every metropolitan planning organization has one. So if you're in a metro region, you can probably use one. So in our case, it's the WFRC, Wasatch Front Regional Council, that has one and operates one. There's an economic software that someone in your state is using. Typically an OBER is using, in our case, the Policy Institute. And there are two typically the most dominant softwares in the country are REMI PI Plus, and an input-output model that's also available. And both of them are fairly similar in their inputs and outputs, just two different companies offering two different software. REMI Plus is used in multiple states. It's used in our state, it's used in Oregon, it is used in Texas and North Carolina. It's a pretty popular use state, but it can also be done in the other software if you really want. So what we are trying to do here is use commonly available tools, surveys, very accessible forms of collecting data, and public agency partners. So if you can't afford to hire a big consultant who has all the capabilities, who has a transportation model and a statistician and economist in it, well, then your best alternative is to collaborate with public agencies that are economists or are transportation modelers or are hazard modelers. And so here, that's what we did. The UATA DEM provides us with some level of hazard modeling. The NPO does travel demand modeling. The ARBA does economic modeling. The Port Institute is our advising organization. It deals with supply chains all day long. And so we have these public agencies which are in everybody's backyards as well. We had two guiding principles for the project. The first was to really keep it simple, right? We wanted this to be easily replicable, but we didn't want to lose quality. So we wanted to make sure that it is very rigorous. So every step of this first phase specifically has been very well thought out. We had multiple discussions, debates about the pros and cons of choosing this variable over that variable, or taking this action over that action. And that is something that will also have to be done. If this process is to be replicated, there's a lot of deliberation that goes into this process. And our report captures some of that deliberations, but of course, we're also writing a manuscript right now, a journal publication on how to replicate this elsewhere. We also wanted to create that first step, the first impact assessment that a lot of communities may not have, especially if they don't have enough money to hire someone. And it's intended to be the first step, not the last word. So once you have this list of the worst at-risk industries, you can do further investigations for those specific industries. So if you have limited dollars, you have $100,000 to spend on public outreach, well, I would target the ones that come up in this list as being the worst at risk. So you can do some level of targeted intervention. You can dig a little deeper if you need to, but it was intended to at least give you some actionable tools or data to work on. For the first phase, and this, I'm going to go over this, it's a huge project. So there is a report that Lacey or Becca can put into the chat for you. The report has every one of these steps in full detail, but I'm going to go over this slightly quicker for our purposes today. We started with an outline of the 7.0 magnitude earthquake in the Wasatch Fault, and this was there was inputted into HAZUS MH software. It was run by the DEM. Now here's a note. We didn't actually run this for the project. This had already been just run. In 2021, they did a HAZUS a run for a 7.0. They did a scenario run for Utah, and we just used that. Now HAZUS MH, what it does is you can say, look, you want to have an earthquake of this magnitude in this kind of fault line. And then what it can tell you is, what the two important things it can tell you: what is the damage and what is a restoration function, especially for infrastructure. It can tell you what extent of damage a specific infrastructure is likely to experience based on the input that you put in, like the kind of road data that you put in, or the kind of rail data that you put in. And then the other thing it can tell you is what's the recovery function. To what extent will it be recovered in what timeline? And so if you have a road link, it can tell you, for example, a road segment or a bridge, which is a dot in a line. It can tell you that this road segment or this bridge will be recovered, say 30% on day 1, 50% on day 7, 80% on day 14. And so there are certain timelines that it actually produces. I think those timelines are day 1, day 7, no, day 1, day 3, day 7, day 14, and I think it's 90. Sorry, day 30 and 90. And I apologize if I'm getting some of these wrong, but there's actually more than a few timelines in which it tells you these things. So from when we run the HAZUS model, we got from the HAZUS model for the transportation network a recovery function. And that we got for roadways, highways, bridges, rail, and air networks. When we looked at this data, though, we had to make some critical decisions. And again, here's the moment of deliberation. What can we do? What is this used for? We had to focus on roads for two reasons. The first is air, we found, did not have much disruption at all. We have a brand new airport in Salt Lake City. It's brand new spanking. It's doing really well, and it's built to be functional recovered. So that is to say, it's built to above standards, and it's expected to come back online by 48 hours. That's not much of a disruption, right, to the economy. And so we took air out of the equation. And then we looked at the rail data and we realized the rail data had not been updated before we ran the HAZUS run. And so that was not up-to-date data. And secondly, we didn't have a model that could actually do the travel modeling for rail. Those are national level models and typically owned by the railway companies. And so we had to take rail out of this equation. Of course, if other regions have that capacity, they can most definitely also add rail back or air, depending on whichever is their supply mode. So here we ended up focusing on the road network specifically. Now, the next step was to make this ready to be put into a travel demand model. So now we have damage, right? We know how much each road or bridge would be affected by the earthquake. And we know in what timeline it will restore itself. So for example, if we have the road, which I said was maybe 30% affected, recovered only 30% on day 1, 50% on day 7, 75% on day 90, then we can reinterpret that as a capacity. That road is only functioning at 30% capacity, 50% capacity, 70% capacity in those timelines. And so that data can be inputted into a travel demand model as a capacity measure. So we reinterpreted the recovery function as a capacity of bridges and roads. Now, what I'm not saying here in enough detail is how long it took. This was probably the biggest challenge we had. And it was the most time-consuming part of this project. It's also the only reason why we only modeled 2 dates in the travel demand model: capacities on day 1 and capacities on day 30. And this is because in HAZUS, all the bridges are point features and segments are line features, but in the travel demand model, everything is a line feature. And so to reinterpret where that bridge exactly is, how many links run through each bridge, transfer the capacity into every bridge into those links took a long, long time. We've also described this process in our report, so it is replicable. You can actually replicate sphere community, but this was, and communities that planned perhaps a little better than us could do more times. It becomes important later, and I'll explain how. But this is the pre-prepping part of inputting this data into the travel demand model, which is what we do. And what we got is estimated vehicle hour travels for trucks on 3 timelines in the normal conditions without an earthquake, on day 1, where we have reduced capacities, and day 30 of the second point of time for reduced capacities. And so now for every link, we have what is the normal condition delay, what is the delay which would happen on day 1, and what would happen on day 30. And so this is vehicle hour travels for trucks specifically, because trucks are more supply chain related. And that we process by looking at cost of delay. Now we know, if you know how many hours a certain truck is going to be delayed, there's actually a cost of delay figure that you can use. It's published by the Census Bureau, Bureau of Economic Analysis. And you can analyze that cost. And to analyze it, this is where the tricky bit comes. Because ideally, we would have gotten the delay on day 1, day 7, 14, 30, 90, and be able to have a curve, which we could have mapped. But because we only had 2 dots, what we did is we developed the curve based on the recovery function from HAZUS, but then fitted the curve by using the 2 delays that we had gotten through the travel demand model. Again, this step is better explained in the report. And so now we have a recovery function and a cost, right, of how much we have annually. We have a cost of how much delay because of truck travel is happening in each county. And that gives us a figure that we can input into REMI Plus, and that eventually gives us the top worst affected industries. This last part requires a little explanation, so I'm going to go into it a little bit more detail. Now, REMI Plus is that software that does economic analysis, basically a regional scale. And primarily what it can do is it can impact the effect of any stressor, and earthquakes are a stressor. Now, what we're saying is, look, if there's some reason for delay in this region, what would be the effect of that on the supply chain or the production outputs of different types of industries? And so we knew from the travel demand model what the day 1 and day 30 vehicle hour travels was. We could annualize that by using the recovery function. And at the end of the day, we have a figure for the entire region. So for instance, we can say that, look, within the region annually, if there's an earthquake, on an annual basis, we will have 2.23 million vehicle travel hours of delay, right? And so once we have this and we have it broken down by county, we basically add up the delay for every link within each county, and we get an aggregate at the county level. Once we have this, we can apply this to what we in REMI is a percentage in a reduction in output. And we can tell you, if you have this much delay, then this is the level of production, reduced production you will have in this industry. And here we are looking at intermediate demand. Now in economics, there are two types of demands that we think about. We think of intermediate and final. Intermediate is goods you need to produce other goods. So if you are a toilet paper making factory, you need paper. And so that is intermediate demand, right? My demand for paper to make toilet paper. The final demand is the consumer buying the toilet. So the demand from the consumer side for toilet paper is called final demand. Because we're looking at supply chains, we are looking at what affects production specifically. We are looking at, that's why we affect intermediate demand. And so here, that's why we're looking also at production outputs. In other words, if I was to say this in simple words, basically an earthquake, 7.0 magnitude earthquake would reduce the transportation and warehousing industry production by 21% in the Wasatch Front, or wholesale trade would drop by 5.2%, etc. But that's of course not enough. What we can also do is monetize that. If you know how much production, reduction you'll end up having, you can now say what will be the dollar impact on your industry. And this is the final list. This is the list that comes out of phase one. If someone asked you what are going to be the worst affected industries in the Wasatch Front, well, the gray highlighted ones are the top 10. And you can see they're organized by reducing impact. So the highest impact is going to be to manufacturing. And this isn't millions of dollars. So the 1478 is not $1,478. It's $1.4 billion. So you will have $1.4 billion effect on manufacturing, and real estate comes next. And the total, if there are two takeaways from this table, you want to say the total loss that you will experience in a 7.0 earthquake just to intermediate demand, goods you need to make goods, is going to be $6 billion over the course of the year, in that year. And I want to point out two things. First, this is only roads. We haven't even talked about rail, and rail plays a big role in supply chain. So it's a very conservative effect, conservative estimate. And two, it's only intermediate demand. We haven't even talked about final demand, and we haven't talked about things like loss to buildings or loss to employees, those kinds of things, which add on to the economic impact. So pretty conservative figure here. The other thing to note in this table is that 4 out of the top 5 Utah industries are in the top 10. So the ones that are highlighted in red are actually within the top 5. These are our major industries. And so our major industries are going to take a major hit. And this is, I hope, a wake-up call. So this is what we had been working towards in phase one. We wanted to know if we had an earthquake, which would be the worst affected industries. Now that we know this, we can actually target our outreach towards what will be the worst affected industries, manufacturing, real estate, etc. These are the industries we should be prioritizing outreach about mitigation, resilience building, etc. in. And of course, the way we have done this is highly replicable. We're using softwares that you already have. It's a big discussion, it's collaboration. That's the key to getting here. But like I said, we didn't want to stop here. We wanted to know, well, now that we know that these are the top 10 at-risk industries, well, how are they doing? What are they doing? Right. So the second phase of it was to study the impact of 2 existing disasters on those top 10 industries, industrial sectors. And we have had those 2 disasters. The first was a 2020 Magna earthquake that happened in March. And simultaneously, we had COVID-19. And I say simultaneously because it really was. The same week that we had the first lockdown in March was the week we had the Magna earthquake. Magna is located just outside of Salt Lake City on the west side, but it was a 5.7 magnitude earthquake, and we sure felt it. And we had damage in our downtown, but also, of course, in Magna. So we looked at Salt Lake City businesses and to understand what actions they had taken after the 20 Magna earthquake, but also how they were affected, particularly in terms of supply chain and production. And we wanted to also know, well, now that they have this disaster, are they better prepared for the next time? Right? And this is really important because we want to have a better understanding of when that 7.0 magnitude earthquake happens. Will our businesses be okay, or what kind of help do we need to do? And this, what kind of help we need to provide to these businesses as well. Two things to note here: we're only focusing on the top 10 affected industries, the ones that had more than $150 million impact from the disaster. And that we only focused on Salt Lake City. This was really logistics. We just didn't have the time or the money to do other places, but we have the survey and the potential to do in other places if they can raise the funds, or if anyone needs to. And we'd be happy to share the survey as well. Now, in the survey, a little bit about the survey. There's a database called the Emergent Intellect Database that is operated. It's a private database, but we at the university have access to it. And so what we did is we took out all the top, we got a list of businesses in those top 10 affected sectors from the Emergent Intellect Database for Salt Lake City. And IRB, Utah's ethics board, requires us researchers to not cold call. So we had to actually call every business and say, do you want to take a survey? And we got 327 yeses. And then we sent them an email to say, here's a survey that you agreed to do. And of course, not everybody answers. And so we had 130 responses of the 327. And that's about a 40% rate. Of the businesses that responded to us, the size is about 57.5 employees. It sounds a lot, but actually by SBA standards, small businesses are businesses with less than 50 to 1,500 employees. This is based on sector. A factory having 1,500 is a small factory, and a business having less than 50 business is a small business. Like retailers having less than 50 is a small retail business. And so if you see, going by those standards, most of our respondents were fairly small. These are small businesses. They're also really long-standing businesses. The median years of operation is 20. That's a lot, right? So we're not talking about new businesses. We're talking about businesses which have been there, established. About 1/5 of those were minority-owned, self-reported, and also self-reported to be women-owned businesses. By and large, almost all the businesses have been affected by COVID. About 60% of them said they had had a negative effect. And about 23% reported a positive effect, which sounds really strange, but actually we know from experience that certain industries do well after disasters because the disaster recovery in itself raises an economy that they can answer to. And about 47% said that they had been affected by Magna, which is not a surprise because A, the epicenter was outside the city, and B, only parts of the city were affected. So we are not surprised that only 47% said, but that's still not insignificant. About 23% of those said that there was a negative impact. And here the discrepancy between negative and positive impact is much higher, which is understandable because earthquakes also affect your building. So yes, sales might be doing great, but now you have to repair your building. And so you could have a more negative impact on more physical disasters. The survey had a little overrepresentation, a little underrepresentation. We suspect that the overrepresentation was from people who were in the office. We had to call to recruit for the survey. And if you were not doing work from home, well, then those are the people we got, right? On the other hand, if you were working from home, like in professional, scientific, and technical services, then we missed you, right? Or retail trade, that's just probably either the store is closed or you're too busy to pick up the phone, which happens for retail anyway. So we had some over and under representation that we can probably address by, adjusting, doing a sample bias correction when we start really doing a regression analysis. Where what we found is that on the average, businesses closed about 12 weeks, and that there was a significant impact on business activity. About 1/3 had said that their activity, number of sales that they get, is actually about 1/3 of them said it had decreased. And about the same percentage said that their revenue had also decreased. But there was a pretty significant majority that had said that they had had an increase, right, of that, of the two disasters on their operations. And we really puzzled over this because we could see that they had had other kinds of impacts and they were reporting impacts in negative impacts in other ways. But we figured that the answer might really lie in what sectors we got in our sample, maybe this relates to the sample bias or overrepresentation, because the overrepresented, the respondents came from industries that we know from research are the quickest to recover. Things like real estate and finance and waste management, for example, these are like really back on their feet a lot quicker. And so maybe that's why we're seeing a more mixed picture. But there's a clearer picture in other ways. So for example, in terms of business operations, we had a number of people who reported all kinds of issues that they had on their operations. But the number one was impact on production cost. And this is really a good validation of what we are seeing in our estimates. Because we used in phase one of the primary points that we wanted to see was, well, what will be the effect on production? And here we have businesses that say that in a disaster, they have experienced a reduction in production cost or on production, an impact on production. And so this in some ways validates what we are saying in phase one. There are, of course, other issues. There are labor availability issues. And remember that there's a pandemic going on, so the masks, the social distancing, those were really hard to do. There was some impact on, on the building, although that was a little bit because, like I said, Magna earthquake only happened, affected some parts of the city. So the point here being that production actually features very high in terms of impact on businesses. When businesses are in a disaster, their production is in fact highly affected. And this is something that we as planners and emergency management, transportation planners need to know. In terms of supply and demand managed specifically, what 75% of our respondents said that they had a supplier delay, either domestic or foreign, didn't matter. And if you recall, the pandemic had a significant supply effect. We had all the industry that shut down, the transportation network had shut down, and we're still feeling the after effects of it. And of course, Magna earthquake affected transportation routes, road damage, and so we also saw an effect of that. So definitely a variety of transportation related effects on the businesses, delivery to customers, and finding an alternative supplier is really hard. But more than 30% of the businesses said that they had really hard time finding an alternative supplier, which is not great for our supply chain resilience, right? And then actually producing the goods that they had to produce because of the delays and like finding employees, making sure masking, safety concerns that had affected their own production. In terms of what they did, so those are like impacts, but what are these businesses doing? And sort of gives us a window into the kinds of actions businesses typically take, but it also allows us to understand where we can encourage them and what type of actions we can encourage them to do. And there is a variety of actions that are listed here, right? This is from most common action to lowest common action. But the most common action that I took was adjusting their sales and marketing strategy. And this, I think they're reckoning back to COVID. So having to close the storefront and go online, right? Those kinds of things. But there are also other strategies that actually have a longer term impact on the business operation. So for example, they have, some of them had to reduce the number of employees or adjust their capital expenditure. And for instance, if you had to buy a new fridge for your grocery store, well, now you can't buy it anymore. You have to use that money for, making up for all the loss and profit. And so these kinds of capital operations changes or to employees' labor can really have a long-term impact on the growth of your business. And so you may not feel the effect right now, but you might feel the effect 2 or 3 years down the line. And so you can see that a lot of businesses are taking actions, but some of those actions are sort of short term and some of those are really going to have an impact on these businesses in the long run. It should be noted that in a separate question, when we asked them if they had actually recovered, they thought they had recovered from the disaster. Only 38% said that they had actually fully recovered. That's a good 60% of these businesses saying they haven't recovered from this disaster, right? Now that's a pretty important thing. And then two of those in this graph, there's actually 2 questions specifically about suppliers. We asked them if they had identified new suppliers or whether they've changed existing suppliers. And there's a good like 40% plus that said yes. And of these, in a separate question, when we said, well, if you did change a supplier, what did you do? They said 14% said that they had found a supplier outside of the city and 32 suppliers within. And so you can think of it this way, it's like 1/3 of the people could actually find suppliers within the city. There's a lot of people who could not find the suppliers that they need, right? So the finding a supplier if your transportation network goes bust is going to be a big challenge for these businesses. Well, the last question we wanted to know was, why, you've had a disaster, have you learned anything? Right? So we had a fairly decent 53% of people said, yes, we learned something. But when we asked, okay, what have you done then? What actually actions have you taken? It was crickets. Right? We had like 3 people said that they went to the local SBDC, the Small Business Development Center, and actually talked to someone, right, about what kind of actions they could take. And so in terms of actual actions, we have very little. In terms of awareness, there seems to have been a significant amount of awareness about the disasters, which is a good thing for us. But really, when the rubber meets the road, what matters is the kind of actions you take right now to prepare your businesses. And in that sense, we're a bit lacking. So what are the top takeaways of what we're talking about here? The first is, we're going to have a big disaster. It's going to be very bad, right? We can expect about $6 billion of a loss to production if we have a 7.0 earthquake. And this is just from road damage. We are not even talking about rail. We're not talking about air. If it works in your community, those would be add. We're not talking about actual damage to the business, a building, to labor, none of those, right? It could be worse, is the point. And that 4 out of our 5 top economic sectors are at risk, severely at risk. So a conservative estimate is 6 billion. And that the businesses that are in our region, and if Salt Lake City is an example of it, of an illustration of it, those businesses have experienced transportation disruption related issues. So for example, they have increased production cost or supply interruptions or trouble finding new suppliers. They are challenged by this transportation disruption. So it's something we in the transportation, but also emergency management, we need to start paying a little bit more attention, because it is not just something that affects roads, it really affects our businesses too. And what's worse in some ways, that businesses are not able to capitalize on their increased awareness to actually take mitigation and preparedness action. And this is where we ask for call for action. If the businesses really need help, we ask ourselves why aren't they taking these actions? And so what we need to do is we need to start investing in resilient transportation infrastructure. We can already see what happens when the road is damaged, right? So maybe we need to start talking about retrofitting those bridges, retrofitting our transportation structures so that there is minimal disruption, minimal delay, because we can see what those delays cause to our economy. And this is just the production end of it, right? So we really have to understand that what we do to that one bridge really has a ripple effect 100 times over on our economy. We also need to start thinking about business resilience practices for high impact industries. Now that you know which industries are affected, we have to go start targeting those industries for education and outreach, right? For resilience, mitigation actions, business planning. We've seen in communities that just having a business plan can actually make your business more resilient to disasters. But then we also have to ask ourselves, why aren't some businesses taking action? What are the structural barriers to building resilience? And we need to start thinking, look, if we are in a recovery moment from the pandemic, right? We are giving funding to businesses, but are we really using that funding to also prepare for the next disaster? So when we give businesses funding for recovery, we have to ask ourselves, what advice can we give to businesses right now when they're really aware of the potential of the next disaster to take a little extra action? And for that, really, what we need to do is break down the silos. It happens that economic development agencies are already talking to businesses, but they're not thinking in terms of disasters. It happens that transportation planners are thinking about, long range planning, but they're not thinking in terms of disasters. Or if they are, it's a special event. And what we say is that we should be mainstreaming disasters. Disasters is not like a separate document, hazard mitigation planning, emergency planning. It's not a separate document. You need to be talking about it when you're doing your long range planning. Just like when you're thinking about building a new road, you're like, well, how much land do I have? Well, that's also the time to say, well, is there a fault line under this road, right? That's when you should be thinking about hazards. Same thing for economic development. When you're talking to small businesses and saying, look, you should be looking at, a business plan, that's when you should say, have you thought about your supply chain and what would happen in the moment of hazard? So we need to start engaging in resilience planning while we're doing economic development planning, transportation planning. And very importantly, we need to start talking to each other, which we don't do a lot of. Transportation planners need to meet economic development planners and then have a conversation about, hey, I do this work, how does this affect you? And we do this work, and how does it affect you? And one of the best things that came out of our collaborative process was those conversations. Our economists met our transportation modelers, and they said, oh, what kind of models do you use? And we use this data. And oh, wow, like I didn't know this would happen in a disaster. And so how it's a great moment of innovation and creativity when those great minds meet. And so we really encourage breaking down the silos between go meet your transportation planners. They are friendly and they dress snappily. And the same thing goes for your mitigation planners. So go meet these people. There are, of course, caveats to every study. In this one, we didn't consider the aftershocks. HAZUS does not consider aftershocks, unfortunately, but aftershocks are a reality. Our Magna earthquake happened in March 18th or something, 2020. We had an aftershock last week. And so we are having aftershocks even now, and those things can make your impact worse. We didn't use rail because we didn't have that model available to use, but in other places you may have that, and it may play a bigger role in some of those places. We assumed debris clearance could happen immediately, which of course is not true. Debris clearance might take time, so recovery functions can actually be affected by how long it takes to clear up the road before you can start to repair it. Now, we wanted fragility assessment data. This is basically how fragile each bridge is. We didn't have that data, but it can be incorporated in the HAZUS if you have it. We only ran the travel demand models for day 1 and 30 because basically we ran out of time. And we looked at only intermediary demands. I mentioned this before, not final demand. And that it is only transportation disruption. We haven't looked at things like production, impact on production value, or like value of goods. I mean, transporting gold is a lot, delays to transport gold is a lot more impactful than delays to transport bananas in some ways. Maybe it's the reverse. Maybe bananas are more valuable. But we didn't even look at what happens if the product is stuck on the road and how much loss there would be. So there are many caveats to this. But another way of thinking about this is that if you started to add up all of these things, the answer would be way more than $6 billion. And so in some ways, this is the reason for the conservative effects. And these can easily be overcome if you did have those kinds of data. And with that, I'm going to end my presentation and I will take questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Divya. Great job. The Q&A box is open. We're taking questions now. To get us started, I have a question. If this analysis was sort of focused on local or regional supply chains in the Wasatch Front, was there any consideration of like freight traveling through the area with a destination farther away from the region?
No, unfortunately, the travel demand model does not do through traffic. That is another limitation that we mentioned in the report. Actually, I didn't say it here. But if you have that data and our work is eminently customizable, this framework is very much, it's the whole point of this is customizable frameworks. It could be added in if that is of importance. But yes, we understand that we are only talking about supply chains within the region. We're not talking about supplies coming in from outside. Although some of that we have some indications of that in the survey as being of importance. But the answer is no, actually it does not look at through traffic. It only looks at traffic that's generated within one county and is going to another county.
That makes sense. Another question was, you mentioned a few examples, but I wondered what might be some other actions that small businesses could take to mitigate against future disasters. I mean, I know you mentioned like getting training and consultation. I wondered if you had any other thoughts on that.
Absolutely. I think first knowing your hazard risk is really, really important. And part of that hazard risk is exposure. Are you in earthquake region? Are you in hurricane region? Like, I'm going to get a flash flood. Knowing your hazard risk is important, but also knowing the condition of your building is really important. In Utah, we suffer from, we have a lot of unreinforced masonry. I call it, we're suffering from the URM problem. But the unreinforced masonries are a severe risk to earthquakes, and we have a lot of those. So knowing if your building is at risk is the start. But of course, there are a bunch of things that you can do. For instance, getting business interruption insurance, which is a really important fallback measure. Having a business plan, like how would you operate if there was a disaster? That's continuity planning, right? If you're a big disaster, thinking about digital ways of saving your data recovery plans, you should have those. Just knowing your supply chain analysis, having an analysis of the supply chain. A little known fact is that the Utah Department of the Governor's Office of Economic Development actually has a free software that can help you map your supply chains. But are they using it for businesses that are coming in for recovery support? We've had COVID, and there are grants that are being offered. When these businesses come in for recovery support, well, that would be a good time to say, hey, did you know we also have a supply chain analysis software? You can just quickly map out where your supply chain issues are so you can prepare for the next disaster. And so there are actually a lot of actions that businesses can take as a plugin. Thank you for doing this. We're actually looking at what actions businesses can take. We're also looking at whether recovery programs are promoting those types of actions. We have a report on the Natural Hazards Center website, and perhaps Lacey or Becca can enter that into the chat box, my email address. If you email me, I'm happy to give you a copy of that report that more directly addresses actions that businesses take for mitigation resilience. Thank you. I hope that answers.
Great, and we have another question, a comment, interesting work. And then the question is, to clarify, what is your assumptions for the duration and magnitude of disruption when coming up to the estimates of cost of earthquake disruption to industry? My questions are, how much uncertainty is there in these estimates, and how can we quantify or present them? And relatedly, is there research comparing the ROI of reinforcing infrastructure now with strapped government budgets, huge uncertainty, versus readiness for repair and recovery?
Thank you. I can see the question from Linma. There are multiple questions here, and I'll try and address these one by one as much as I can. The duration magnitude, as I mentioned earlier, was a 7.0 magnitude earthquake in the Wasatch Fault. It is considered to be one of the most low probability, high impact earthquakes. It's also the most commonly modeled scenario for the Wasatch Front. Critically, it was a scenario that had just been modeled for the Wasatch Front, so we could use the data as the starting point. The probability of a 6.7 plus earthquake happening in the Wasatch Front is about 43%. So highly likely, I guess. There are, of course, other probabilities that are, uncertainties that are built into the models themselves. So the uncertainty of hazards is already published. That's the uncertainty we have. The uncertainty of travel model estimates, that's the uncertainty we have, and same for the revenue. So our uncertainty levels are the same that are basic to the model, inherent in these models. In terms of, and yes, I think you can quantify them by just looking at the technical documentation on these models. And relatedly, how much, you said, is there a ROI for infrastructure? Now, this is a really great question, and there has been, in fact, a study on this. I think NIST did the study, or maybe it was NIMS. At any rate, FEMA has this, it was funded partly by FEMA. So I don't know if it's infrastructure specifically, but I think it's infrastructure and the built environment. So it's more than just infrastructure, but they actually have quantified the impact or return of investment on mitigation. And the answer is that for every $1 that you spend on mitigation, you save $6 on recovery. So it's 1:6. So if you mitigate now, whatever dollars that you spend, you will save 6 times that. If you didn't mitigate, and you had to recover. So there is, in fact, a fairly good figure. And I'm sure if you just looked up, I think it's called Mitigation Saves report, and if you just Google for it, you will find out, you can see the whole report. It was a fairly big federal study on this topic. So with that, I think I'll move to the next question.
Yeah, so when only 38% of businesses said they were fully recovered, how long after the magna earthquake was that?
Thank you. The survey was done this spring. So we're talking about from January to to May. We took 5 months to do the survey. So 2 years, about 2 years after the disaster, we are still only 40% fully recovered. And we just completed a similar business study in Puerto Rico after the 2017 Hurricane Maria, and we had even a smaller percentage. So if anything, we know from previous business recovery studies that businesses normally take a very long time to recover, but that their recovery comes in phases. They might reopen immediately, but actually close 3 years down the line. Unlike what we usually think of, oh, the businesses are going to be affected and they'll just close from day one. That's not true. A lot of businesses actually struggle for a very long time before they call it a day. So really, if you wanted to understand business recovery, you really have to keep going long term.
Great, thank you. So I have another question. This might not be within the scope of the study, but just thinking the earthquake and the lockdown that both happened in March 2020, how did that event sort of compare to the potential magnitude of disruptions that might occur from the next big earthquake?
I think there's the interesting thing about it's compound disasters, right? You're already having pandemic, and you have an earthquake. Suddenly harder to find someone to come and work in your house because they have to mask and social distance. And you can imagine that when we had the Magna earthquake, we didn't know much about social distancing. We didn't know much about COVID. We didn't know, is it airborne? We used to think it was touch. I don't know if you remember all these things, right? Like, is it touch, or how far do you have to be? And will masks work? And cloth masks work? And what kind of mask will work? And so there's a lot of uncertainty around whether you could get help. Can someone enter your house? Can they not enter your house? And in fact, our research on how people managed at the governmental level, how they managed response for the earthquake in the context of pandemic really raised some of these questions about sanitizing. People not able to come and actually inspect your home for structural engineers couldn't come inside the house and look to see because they could not enter your house. And so there were, of course, a lot of compounding effects of a lot of challenges, more complexity added because the two disasters are happening. Now, how it compares to the long run, we actually think that the big one, we actually think that the 7.0 magnitude earthquake, even the 6.75, is going to be way more impactful on us than the COVID pandemic has been. You can imagine that the COVID pandemic has affected the operations end of your business, but not the physical end of the business. But the earthquake, it's going to bring your business, your office down, and you're going to have to spend a lot more money rebuilding your office. And there's going to be a lot of questions about whether you should rebuild the office and what time you should rebuild it, where will you get the money from? So it's going to be, we think that the earthquake will actually be a lot more impactful negatively impactful on the Utah economy. There's also going to be displacement of consumers, right, which didn't quite happen in the COVID. The consumers were still there. They were not coming to your building, but they were still there. And so you could adjust to online sales, distributed kind of different types of grocery delivery models, etc. But in an earthquake, those consumers are not going to be around. They might have gone off to Boise, Idaho, or Denver because there's no water, there's no power. So there will be a lot more, there are a lot of secondary impacts or indirect impacts from larger damage to the region. So in some ways, it's going to be worse. Sorry, I wish I had a nicer answer. But
thank you. I guess we'll give a couple more minutes if folks have more questions. But thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting. I guess while we're giving people some more time, I have maybe sort of a squishier question I was thinking about when it comes to sort of breaking down the silos between the different fields, transportation planning, economic development. I'm just wondering what you see as sort of the role of the university in forming those partnerships, like through research projects like this, or is it like more of just changing the way we educate future professionals? Do you have any thoughts on how universities can help do that?
All of the above.
Okay.
Just take everything you just said, Lacey, and let's publish it. But that's the answer. Like, part of your assets are the university. And for those of you that work at a university, good for you. But if you do not work at a university, please know that your university is a resource. They are state funded. Their mandate is to help you. And there are multiple researchers at the university. You're just waiting to hear from you. And of course, they should also be coming to meet you. So every time there is a university sort of event, I would go. And if you're a university researcher, please reach out to your local communities. They need your help. This happened because, as I mentioned, the genesis of this was a conversation that we were just having. The FEMA folks, the local emergency management folks, just reached out to us because we have been doing work in the local community on resilience and emergency management disasters. And they said, oh, like, hey, do you do this? And we said, oh, we don't do this, but the Policy Institute does it. And maybe what we can do is we can put this together with that and that together with that. And the fact is, universities work with multiple types of people. It's actually much easier for university researchers to build networks than sometimes it is for organizations, because between organizations, there's a protocol of how you talk, etc. So it's actually universities that are a lot more, they move horizontally. And so it was easier for us. I have colleagues that work with WFRC. It was easier for them to contact WFRC. I know somebody in the Portland Authority, I just called them up. So the universities have a lot more flexibility in moving between networks. And so in some ways, the universities are very well positioned to do collaborative work and to lead collaborative work. And I think if you're at a university, you should definitely take this on. It should be part of your work. And if you're not, then please know that the universities are more than a resource to do this kind of work. I hope that answered your question, Lisa.
Great, thank you. No, that was a great answer. Well, thanks very much again for the presentation. I think we'll go ahead and wrap things up here. I'm putting a link in the chat right now to the event page for the webinar. And again, if you're tracking your professional development hours, you'll find a certificate on that webpage about within 24 hours after the event, as well as a link to the video recording and the presentation slides. So thanks again, Divya, and everyone, thanks for joining us and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you for having me.